Today, I'm going to review Masvitas Chiramuta's new book, The Brain Abstracted. It came out in 2024, published by MIT Press. It has been published open access, so there's a PDF of it which I'll put a link to in the description. For context, Chiramuta is a senior lecturer in philosophy at Edinburgh University. I read this book because my main philosophical interest is applying philosophy of science on idealization and abstraction to psychiatry. I'm mainly interested in applying them to psychiatric diagnoses, expert by experience research, and self diagnosis. So it really interested me to see idealization and abstraction applied to neuroscience, which is not an area I study but is very relevant for my interest in psychiatry. Chiramuta is drawing upon some specific philosophies of science which I really like, namely Neo-Kantianism and scientific perspectivism. I'm really enthusiastic about this book, and to give away the conclusion of my review, I think the book is fantastic. I'm now going to outline the review of the book, and then at the end briefly point out some potential implications for psychiatric diagnoses and neurodiversity. Chiramuta's main idea is that neuroscience involves significant idealization, abstraction, and general simplification when modeling the brain. Chiramuta outlines an account of idealization and abstraction in science. This does involve some pretty conventional notions of model building in science. When doing science, we abstract details, distorting them, and we idealize, which involves false claims. We take the data and turn it into a model by abstracting and idealizing the data. How we go about doing this depends upon our values and what we think is relevant, which in turn depends upon our purposes. All of this is pretty standard philosophy of science on model building. However, Chiramuta allies this model building account with an Ernst Cassirer inspired Neo-Kantian position. It is not surprising I like the book because Cassirer is my favourite philosopher. I think the easiest way to understand Cassirer is that we are presented with an infinite variation within sensation, and we need to apply something which comes from us to group that infinite sensation into things. Regardless of whether you posit a world of mind-independent objects, which is one way to understand the Kantian thing in itself, the only objects we can know of are ones we impose onto that infinite sensation. In this sort of vein, quoting Chiramuta, quote, "To conceive of flowers is to create a filter in one's mind for all the regularities shared in common among flowers, ignoring the particularities that distinguish kinds of flowers and individual flowers from one another, and disregarding all else that is not flowery in the world." End quote. So in a sense, we are ignoring aspects of reality when we think of two things as being flowers, since both those flowers have aspects that is beyond what is being covered by a flower. Additionally, when we think of general classes, we distort what is going on in individual cases. Quoting Chiramuta, quote, "No real spherical ball could be a perfect sphere, and yet the perfect sphere, the one defined geometrically, is somehow the ideal shape that the real ball aspires to. With these geometric idealizations, it is always the case that the ideal form is more regular and symmetric, simpler than the real one." End quote. So our models do not fully resemble what is going on in the world. Our models are simplifying and distorting compared to what is going on in the real world. This aligns with Cassirer since he thinks our scientific notions are not reproducing an underlying reality, rather they are adding something which transforms the underlying reality into something else. Chiramuta writes that, quote, "From Cassirer, I borrow the thought that this kind of idealization, the projection of the observed, jumbled, real-world system onto a plane of ideal order, involves a reconstitution of the concrete objects of science in alien terms." End quote. In other words, when we produce a model, we add something on which is not there in reality. The model is a reconstitution, a transformation which does not resemble the real world. So how does all this relate to the brain? Chiramuta outlines in great deal the complexity of the brain. She outlines the sheer number of neurons, the complexity of their interconnections, how brains are constantly changing, and how no two brains are identical. From this, we can claim that any knowledge we have of a brain will be a simplification. Given the complexity and constantly changing nature of a brain, we can never capture a brain as it is in itself, rather, we can only make imperfect descriptions of it. Our simplifications miss out the complexity. This is a Neo Kantian interpretation whereby the simplifications are something we are adding on. The brain itself is not simple, whereas we are adding that simplicity, meaning our models of the brain have added something on that comes from us which is not there in external reality. Similarly, our models aim to describe regularities in the brain, but those regularities are actually put into the model through our simplifications. The regularities are not in the brain, since the brain is irregular. We are the ones who put the regularities in. Chiramuta says that, quote, I am not asserting that the world is formless. What I'm saying is that the forms and regularities that are simple enough to be intelligible to the scientist and reproduced in their models and theories should not be taken to exist independently of this work. End quote. Whatever form the world might have outside of our modelling, we can only know of a different form, the form that we give it through our modelling. This neo-Kantian and scientific perspectivism position is in contrast with standard accounts of scientific realism, whereby our ideas correspond with external reality. Chiramuta says that, quote, standard realism is not possible, I argue, when those systems are so complex that any scientific categories and concepts employed to describe them are the result of active construction of simple patterns and regularities to which the theoretical terms refer. End quote. The simplifications we make when modelling block the possibility of correspondence to an external reality because whatever we could correspond to is not simple. So all of this gives a really interesting, nuanced, and novel understanding of neuroscience, which goes beyond scientific realism and anti-realism by highlighting that we are adding something when model building. These general ideas are highlighted across multiple chapters which discuss historical and more recent neuroscience. For example, there is content on how reflexologists produced results in laboratories which are not representative of situations outside of a laboratory because they falsely assumed that the individual parts they were studying were not context dependent. Similarly, behaviorists did not recognize the possibility that the simple responses to stimuli that they studied were not relevant for the more interconnected conditions in real-world settings. There's also content on functionalism and attempts to understand the brain as a computer, which misses out on the complexity of biological systems, including how computers do not undergo biological changes to their inner components due to interactions with the environment, whereas biological cells do have changes due to environmental interactions. These and other episodes in past and present neuroscience highlight how neuroscientists are producing models that miss out on the complexity that is present in brains. Chiramuta also makes some broader philosophical observations. Chiramuta points out how her account is potentially problematic for contemporary analytical philosophy of mind. Philosophers sometimes draw upon modern science when developing philosophies of mind, but this is problematic because neuroscientists are not directly describing the brain but are producing simplified descriptions of it. This might mean those philosophers are developing philosophies of mind that are not particularly applicable to actual minds. Also, Chiramuta outlines how some philosophies of science link together understanding and prediction, but Chiramuta shows that methods used by neuroscience are sometimes good at prediction but contain so many variables that they defy understanding. Meanwhile, the models that we can understand are not particularly good at prediction. This should make us question the link between understanding and prediction. Finally, there is content on why Chiramuta thinks that AI cannot attain consciousness. I think the book is excellent and well worth reading if you're interested in neuroscience, scientific models, or neo-Kantianism and scientific perspectivism. Also, I found the book to be pretty accessible given I'm not a trained neuroscientist. I'm now going to relate the book to some of my own particular interests. I think the book indirectly helps us support the legitimacy of psychiatric diagnoses. Critics of psychiatric diagnoses sometimes claim that psychiatric diagnoses are constructed, in contrast to proper science, which is real rather than constructed. However, Chiramuta shows that neuroscience is much more complicated than simply describing reality, and that neuroscience contains lots of elements that we have added which are not actually present in actual brains. So I think that a lot of the criticisms of psychiatric diagnoses, that they do not reflect reality and are based upon decisions made by psychiatrists, might also be applicable to neuroscience. This makes psychiatric diagnoses look more respectable and more scientific compared to what their critics claim, given that idealizations and abstractions are actually present in lots of different sciences, including neuroscience. The book might also have implications for neurodiversity. Typically, diagnoses like autism and ADHD are seen as, depending on the terminology employed, neurodiversities or neurodivergences, which are an integral part of selfhood and personality. If, however, our understanding of neuroscience is based upon simplified models that do not grasp the complexity of the brain, then perhaps this account of neuroscience is more applicable to those simplified models and less applicable to actual brains. Perhaps typical notions of neurodiversity are emphasizing psychiatric diagnoses as being central and static in a manner that does not actually fix the complexity and changing nature of real brains. So I think the book has philosophical implications beyond neuroscience, so it's worth reading if you're interested in an area of psychiatry than just neuroscience. Thank you for listening.